Welcome everybody to the April Animal Care Wednesday webinar. I'm Heidi Carroll. I'm a South Dakota State Extension Field Specialist in Livestock Stewardship. The Animal Care Wednesday webinars are a partnership between South Dakota, Iowa, Missouri, and Nebraska Extension and 4-H personnel. We provide some timely topics that hopefully we can take back to our clientele, improve our understanding in terms of animal care and well-being, as well as share those with others. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to test their audio and haven't had any issues. If you do have issues, please use the chat box feature of Zoom, which you can find on the bottom menu potentially, or your top menu, depending on what your screen looks like. Today, we have the honor of having Mr. Randy Sainer out of Nebraska Extension, and he's got the expertise when it comes to goat care and handling. So we're going to kind of cover a broad understanding today, so feel free to start typing any questions that you have in the chat box anytime during the presentation, and we'll address those as we go or either at the end, depending on how Randy sees those questions come in. At the end of our presentation, I will launch a short poll just to kind of get your feedback on today's webinar and how the Animal Care Wednesday webinars programming is for you, or maybe what you are still looking for topics and programming in the future. So you'll see that come on your screen, so we encourage you to click your responses at that time. I'm not seeing anybody having any issues, so I'm going to go ahead and turn over today's presentation to Mr. Sainer and let you take it away for goat care and handling.
Okay, thank you. On this first page, I wanted to, at the bottom, I've got a guide sheet that I wrote for Nebraska. It's pretty basic. It could work for South Dakota and Iowa too, as far as just basic goat production. Some of my information comes out of there, as well as some other presentations I've done. So we'll get to the next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about just basic tips on goats. Goats are referred to as small ruminants, meaning they have a 4-chambered stomach like sheep and cattle. I have the ruminant lab today in Grand Island, so we were talking about that already. Goats do not like to get wet, and they'll seek shelter in the rain, and they were developed because they were developed in a desert climate. A person needs to have a place for them to get out of the rain. They don't do very well if they get really wet. So they're kind of finicky that way. And they don't do well in cold either. They're not quite as strong or willing to last as long with baby goats as baby lambs. They need some heat lights and so forth under them, just if it's really cold, because they don't have a lot of fat there to really help them because of where they were developed. Goats prefer to browse brush and trees. They'll get on their hind legs to eat them. And they seem to be more susceptible to parasites in grazing situations than cattle and even sheep. And they can be contained if you have properly constructed fences. That's a challenge with goats. They do like to get out. They will find every hole in the fence. But you're going to need more strands of electric wire to control a goat than for cattle. Usually we figure 5, 42 inches high. Or you can use panels that are 4-inch squares. If you use a traditional feedlot panels, goats get their heads stuck in them. They need to be smaller squares if you're going to have them used for goats, because they are notorious for getting their horns stuck. Barns, as far as shed space, need about 15 square foot per goat, with some ventilation, cooling in the summer, and protection from the weather in or is probably hung shoulder height. Goats are bad about getting in feeders. You can put a pipe through the feeder to keep it from getting in there. If they get in there, they soil the feed, and you get more trouble with coccidiosis and other parasites. Okay. Next one. See if I can get to my next slide. I'm having trouble. Here we go. Okay. Health issues, parasites are the big issue. They're the #1 cause of death in goats in the United States, and it's blood-sucking gastrointestinal parasite, the Homunculus contortus, or the barber pole worm, because it looks like a barber pole. If you remember the old barber poles they used to put up by barbers, they don't so much anymore. Because of the blood vein that runs through them, it looks like a barber pole. The reproductive capacity of this parasite and its resistance to many dewormers make the parasite control one of the limiting factors in goat production. In some countries and some areas, they've had to sell all their goats because they've become resistant to some of the parasites. And so, and especially to the barber pole worm, they're very productive. They produce lots of eggs.
Say, Randy, excuse me for interrupting. We're still seeing your first slide. Did you by chance click that in a different window than the one you're sharing?
Maybe here. Let me check here. We'll go back. Your sharing is paused. It says my sharing is paused. So I don't know how I did that. Let's check and see if I can get that off of there again.
Why don't you just go ahead and hit stop sharing and reselect your sharing screen from your PowerPoint presentation and see if that fixes it.
Okay, now we're going to go back here. You know what? I think I might have two of them up. So let me, okay, no, okay, we're good. Now we'll try it again. Are you seeing it now? Probably not.
Not yet.
Okay, I'm going to get back to my screen. Zoom. Okay, there we go. And then I'm going to do share again. And we're going to go here. I think I know why it did that. So, okay. So I talked about, can you see it now?
So we see your PowerPoint presentation window, but you're selecting, yep. So we see your cursor moving.
Okay, so I'm going to do the from beginning again. We'll try that and see if that works. Okay. Now can you see the first one? Okay, there's the second one, the basic tips.
Yep.
We kind of discussed them. Okay, let's go back to this parasite issue here. And it is an issue in the northern United States. It's getting to be worse, but it's more during the warm times of the year. So it's not as bad as in the south. But the reproductive capacity of that parasite and its resistance to many dewormers make it our limiting factor for goat production. Like I said, in some places they've had to sell their goats because they can't seem to get past it. And we can do that through some management practices, which I'll talk a little bit about. Internal parasite management is all we want to do is we want to reduce the parasite loads. And things we can do to do that: proper rotational grazing, allowing at least 5 to 6 weeks between each grazing. This would be for somebody that's grazing their goats. We'll talk about the 4-H in here in a minute. Frequent and timing of animal inspection using FAMANCHA. In FAMANCHA, I've got a picture of the card. It's where we look at the eye of the animal. We look at a card, and what it tells us the hematocrit of that animal. If it's really pale, that means that there's a lot of blood being taken from that animal and that they have a high load of parasites, so then we're going to deworm them. We don't want to deworm those, though, that don't have a high load, because what happens is those worms become resistant to the dewormer if we worm all of them. If we worm part of them, those worms breed together, and we have more worms that are susceptible to the anthelmintic. Frequent and timing animal inspection, of course, is important. If you really want more information on this, is really a good place to go is that wormx.info that I have on here, that website. They've been working on this for years in the Southeast and have really good information on it. Selective deworming products and correct dosages are really important so you don't build resistance. And then eliminating animals from the goat herd that you have frequent deworming problems with is really important, because it's about a 5 on hereditary, about a 0.5, 0.6. So you can select for parasite resistance. And we're seeing more and more people look at that. The next slide just shows how that sheep or goats get infected with parasites. They basically eat that grass, and you see those little parasites I'll show my cursor here. They eat that grass, and those little parasites are in there, and then they get inside the animal, and they produce these nice worms here, these barber pole worms, from these eggs that were in the manure. So they lay eggs, they go through the manure of the animal, they hatch out. When it gets warm and wet, they get on the grass, and the dew of the grass, the animal eats them. And that's how they're infected. This is a picture of a very parasitized animal, probably died from all the, you can see all the blood inside that stomach, and you can see the barber pole worms. You can even see the kind of the way it looks. You can see looking like a barber pole there. And so this is what we want to avoid. This is a FAMACHA card. You get these. I'm a certified trainer. A lot of your vets are certified trainers. Basically, you look at the color on the card. You look at the color in the eye where that arrow is pointing right here, and you'll determine if you need to worm or not. The thing is, we don't want to worm everything because, again, we want some parasites out there to breed with those resistant parasites, because when you use a dewormer, the worms that are left are all resistant to that wormer, and the more they put out in eggs, the more resistant they get to that product, and you have to switch products. This is a list of classes of wormers. So if you're using one of these wormers in the same class and you get resistance, you need to slip to another class, switch to another class, because they're going to be resistant to all of them in that one class. So you've got really 3 classes of parasite dewormers out there, so there's not a lot to work from. So you need to make sure you keep these working. And so what I recommend is people use one, and as they start seeing resistance, then you need to go switch to the next one. And I like to use, and there is the real parasitized animals. If you're having major problems, sometimes using all 3 classes on one goat is acceptable, and that's a practice for all those goats that are really have a problem. If you got those, though, my thought is you need to get rid of them and try to build resistance in your herd by genetics. This is just a common dewormer use. It also has the withdrawal times, and remember on there, on some of them, it says extra label. That means you have to get a vet's prescription. So the vet needs to have a relationship with you and needs to know what you're doing out there before he's going to give you this medicine. Notice there is withdrawal times on all these dewormers, and if you're selling goats at a fair, you need to make sure you follow the withdrawal times. If you're selling milk, you need to make sure you follow those withdrawal times. Very, very important. Before you slaughter, you need to make sure you follow the days. You know, the easiest one is Valvazin. It's only 7 days. I mean, it's an old drug that's pretty effective, but you just got to watch it. It's sometimes with really sick animals, it's such a strong drug it can kill them. We want you not to buy resistant worms. That's a problem. So when you buy goats from people, you need to make sure you know what kind of worming program they're on, so you can use a program similar to theirs. Or if theirs is not working and they're using a program like yours, that means you're probably going to switch your worming program, because they're going to build resistance up in your herd. You should quarantine them. All new additions, aggressively deworm them upon arrival. Deworm them with 3 anthelmintics from different drug classes that I just showed you. That way you get rid of most of the worms. You're going to get rid of about 99.9% of the worms if you do that. They should remain in quarantine for 10 to 14 days. And I have another slide here that says almost, you know, you could even go longer to 21. That's for other reasons, not just parasites. And you want to perform a fecal egg count to confirm there's no eggs there. But you can do that by getting some of the manure taken into a vet. They can float it, or you can do that yourself if you learn how to do it. There is stuff you can buy to learn how to do your own floating of your eggs in the manure. Other parasites that we need to think about in goats, and you know this is true in show animals too. The lungworm is not as big issue, but it does happen once in a while. But coccidia is a big one. And if you got goats getting up in the feed bunks, they can spread coccidia pretty easy. And coccidia will really work on goats. And so, you know, we want to use it. What we usually recommend is using a coccidia stat in your feed when you're feeding, because that will help you keep from getting an overload of coccidia. Basically, this keeps the number down. Also, liver flukes and tapeworms, those are more problems in the south, but coccidia and then once in a while lungworms can be a problem here. And a lot of your wormers will work on lungworms. You just need to make sure they will. If you think you got a lungworm problem, I would visit with the vet. Another issue would be foot scald or foot rot. It's a common health issue. It results in lameness, often develops in major economically significant disease. It can really cause you problems. The thing about that, if you do good foot baths with zinc sulfate and keep your feet trimmed on your goats, that's going to be a lot less of a problem. The other health issue with if you've got registered stock, if you're showing breeding stock, abortions can be a problem from vibriosis. And we'll talk more about this in another one, but you can vaccinate for that. Chlamydia was a problem in our area. I had people vaccinate. It kind of solved our problem. So you don't want to use these unless they are a problem, but if you start to see a problem, it's probably worth the money to spend. Clostridium perfringens, C&D overeating disease, and tetanus is the most common disease in goats, and it should be immunized against using vaccines of all ages of goats. Some of the vaccines, Covexin, Varvac, CDT, remember it's got to have that T on it. We need tetanus in there too. When initiating vaccination for a given sheep or goat, all enterotoxemia tetanus vaccinations require 2 doses to induce effective immunity. So you need to get 2 doses in them, not just 1. And that's really important for show goats because overeating can really happen when they're eating a lot of feed. And so, and you need to boost them about every 6 to 8 weeks just to make sure that you're not going to have a problem. It's usually the best one that dies, so you want to make sure you follow this. If you're having abortions, again, you can vaccinate for chlamydia, campylobacter, vibrio, or lepto. The other thing on show goats, I would probably think about thiamine or B complex every 6 to 8 weeks. What does that do? It just helps with appetite. Thiamine can be a problem sometimes if you got a lot of distiller's grain. If you get too much in there, it can be a problem. So thiamine is a good protection for that. Sore mouth is one that if you've had trouble, if you do a lot of shows, you might want to vaccinate for sore mouth because people get it. Herds get it off and on. They build resistance, then they're done. Then they lose that resistance, and it shows back up a lot of times with them. So if you're doing a lot of shows, you might be contaminating your goats. You might want to use sore mouth. CL is another disease that affects goats. It's an abscess. Not all abscesses are CL. That's what people have a real problem with. Sometimes it could be a vaccination that people did wrong or got a dirty needle. But you can see the areas where it's at. CL can make that carcass unusable. It can kill the animal. The infection is pus. If you can clean up a herd. I know a person that cleaned up a herd by draining that pus and burning the pus in some kind of incinerator, because you've got to get it out of there, and making sure they disinfected the area of the goat and kept it away from the rest of the goats, because the pus will actually spread to other goats. So you need to isolate them if they get this. And if you can't get rid of it, then you need to call those animals because they're contaminating the whole herd. A lot of times you can solve it just by cutting it open, cleaning it out, and burning it, and keeping the goat isolated from other goats. Foot and vehicle traffic. We look at biosecurity. This is kind of why you want to keep people out of your pens and out of your goats. You want to limit your foot traffic, your vehicle traffic, because they can bring things in. A good boot washing station with some disinfectant, or getting just disposable goats when you got people looking at disposable boots when you're looking at goats is really helpful to keep those diseases and those parasites out of your operation. Quarantine, I said this earlier, new animals for 4 weeks, no contact with your other animals, vaccinate them, deworm them, treat for foot rot and external parasites, and that way you're not putting anything onto your herd that could be on them. You want to disinfect your shearing equipment. Sometimes you can get fungus and stuff from that, and then just use common sense. So I got a picture below, is a picture of foot rot in a lamb. You can see even see the magnet in between the toes there. It's a real problem, and you can smell it a lot of times if you get it. You don't want to get it, so good foot trimming and foot baths will help with that. And don't buy animals that have it. Goats they like to eat high. They like brush. They're browsers. They prefer woody plants, shrubs, and vines. And they're good cleanup artists. If you want to clean up a field from weeds and brush, they'll do it for you. They don't like clover, but they'll eat it, and they don't like to graze close to the soil surface. That's because they get more parasites when they do that, so they've kind of learned not to do that. But they will if they have to, and that's a problem I see with some people. They graze really close, and then they're just really exposing them to parasites. They like to graze the incline or the higher spaces first, or in the drier areas. Wet areas are really a good place for worms. You want to make sure you cut them, mow them off, do anything you can to keep those wet areas so that they don't graze them. And goats tend to have fewer problems with plant toxicities, so they're able to graze things that cattle might die from. And I had a producer that used to graze quite a bit of his poisonous weeds, and he never lost goats. I was amazed. But he would have lost his cows if he wouldn't have done that. So when we look at a 4-H goat, we're taking a brush eater and turning them into a grain-eating athlete, okay? And so what do we have to do that? And I'm going to talk about that in the next few slides, but you can see a brush animal is going to be a little different than an animal that we're feeding and we're walking. Meat goats should be fed a grain-based diet with minimal amounts of hay. The hay we would recommend is like about a size of a bird's nest. So you don't need a lot, just, you can kind of put it in your hand, and that's about all you need. Think about a bird's nest, and that's about how much they need. And that'll keep their rumen working, that'll keep enough forage in them. It'll improve body composition by adding skeleton and muscle if you add some grain to the diet. If you just feed forages, you're not going to get that muscle tone that you would get with some grain or that finish. And there's some different ones. You can see that middle goat. If you look at his body condition, he's narrower. He's not got the condition on him as that one to the left that says C on it. And the one to the far right, again, is a little more conditioned than the one, probably a little more muscular than the one in the middle, probably had a little bit more feed. But you also have to buy muscle too. You can't just expect grain to put it all on. The goat has to have the ability to do that. If we look at feeding managements, do nots, many people feed high roughage diets. That's fine for breeding animals if you're showing breeding animals, but probably isn't going to work good, like I said, for a show goat. It's common to take show feed and add to it. If you're buying a complete show feed, you don't want to be adding a lot of stuff to it because it ruins the balance of the formulated feed. They've already been formulated for the goats, and it makes that bag of feed much more expensive if you have to add a lot to it. I just got a picture of corn grain. That's one of the feeds you may feed with it. Cottonseed is a good one. It's got high in fiber. It's also high in protein. Soybean meal will be one. And of course, you need a small amount of vitamins and minerals for growth. If we look at feeding management, recommended nutrient specs, 15 to 17% protein, which is normally higher than what we'd feed goats. But if you're doing a show feed, you're wanting to develop muscle, you're going to add some protein. You could go down to a 14%, but I would not go with any less than that. Fat, 3 to 4%, and then fiber, notice I got it circled, fiber, 10 to 15%. Why do we want fiber in the feed? Again, we need to keep that rumen working, and goats are fiber eaters. They're not used to eating a lot of corn, and so that fiber helps keep that rumen working well. I got a picture of a goat with the rumen here. A pelleted ration is nice because the goat tends to pick it out. We fed a corn ration, and the goats would always pick out the corn and leave the pellets. And so if you can feed one that's all pelleted, they can't do that, and that makes it an advantage for you in most cases. Quality ingredients are important. Make sure you ask questions. You don't want moldy corn, those kind of things. Is the trace minerals organic or chelated? I'm not sure that that's as important as it could be, but the chelated minerals are going to be a little more useful to the animal. They're going to be able to bring them in their system a little easier. Yeast are nice to keep that animal on feed. It helps with the gut health and digestion. It's not a must, but in a lot of cases it'll help you bring a little more intake into that animal. The one thing I would make sure of is ammonium chloride. Ammonium chloride acidifies that urine, so you don't get a lot of stone formation, because I've seen a lot of show goats die from stones if you don't make sure you keep some ammonium chloride or some kind of acidifier in that urine. Coccidiostat, typically rumensin or decox is added to the feed. I would always recommend putting that in your show feed. It just keeps that coccidia away. You got your animals in a smaller quarters than normally if they were out in the range, which they can get more coccidia that way. So I would sure recommend putting a coccidiostat in the feed. It's just a good safety thing. And remember that performance animals need to be fed as such. So, you got a high performing animal, they have a little higher requirements than an average animal out on range. You want to monitor the body condition score. I have 4 different body condition scores in this slide. It's kind of busy. Adjust the volume of feed, of protein, and fat levels and exercise according to their body condition. Well, body condition is just a measure of the fat and muscle in the carcass. And here I've got a guy's hand over the top. Notice his fist is more clenched on the lighter ones. As we get fatter, the hand spreads out more, so there's more fat over the loin. The loin's a very good place to feel, and you want to feel over the top of that animal. I always figure if you feel that animal and it feels like your knuckles, that means it's probably too thin. If it's starting to feel like where your joint is in your finger, where it turns, if you feel that area, it'll feel kind of like a soft area. That's kind of what you want them to feel like when they're conditioned well. We want minimal hay, like I said, a bird's nest size, a handful 2 times a week is what a lot of people recommend. If you're having trouble with them, you might want to start daily and then go to 2 times a week, because we need a little bit of forage in that room and to work. If you're feeding a feed that has no fiber in it, you need to feed that every day, that bird's nest feed. If you're feeding a feed that's got some fiber in, then you can do it 2 times a week. But it's really important to keep that animal on high grain feeds, some forage to keep that rumen working. And the other thing is, if you feed a lot of hay, meat goat judges don't want to see a huge belly on a goat anyway. So, and then hay will add belly to it. So but you still got to have some. They're a ruminant, by the way. All ruminant animals need some forage. Free choice mineral, if you want to. We did not do that. I've got by without it, but it is a good insurance policy if you do have a problem. And I like a long stem hay. I don't like alfalfa. Some people like alfalfa. I had more trouble with stones when I had alfalfa as opposed to a long stemmed hay. So we usually fed long stemmed hay to our goats when we were getting them ready for show. Feed about 2 to 3% of their body weight, about 1.5 pounds to 3 pounds, depending on the type and kind of goat. Most market goats will max out at about 2.5 pounds of feed. And that's the nice thing about this project. It doesn't take a lot of feed to make it work, but it is important that you get good feed into them. And weigh animals frequently if possible so you know what they're doing. If they're not doing well, then you might want to either switch the feed or change something in your management style because something's not right. Consistency and management, like I said, make a difference. Try to feed them at the same time every day. I think that's really important, especially in a ruminant animal. Otherwise, you'll have digestive upset. Clean the water, pen, and feeder when needed. Watch for signs of parasite or coccidiosis. That's why we worm them, and that's why we put the coccidiostat in the feed. 50% of your effort is going to make a big difference, a 50% difference when you go to show. The more you work with your animal, the better off you're going to do. Feeding 2 to 3 times per day will help maintain a healthy rumen and encourage appetite. And I think we did ours twice a day, but I think 3 times is even better. They'll eat a little bit more if you do that. This will also allow you time to observe the animal to make sure nothing's wrong with it. Because a goat, when they get sick, they can go down fast. I had one get sick on us, and it was a little bit of, we think it was a little bit of parasites. We wormed it, gave it some antibiotic. It came right back and it did really well. But I tell you what, I almost messed up because we took it to the vet and he tubed it right away because I thought we were going to lose it because it went downhill fast. So you need to really watch that. Make feed changes gradually. If you're going from a high fiber, low energy feed to a more corn ration, again, you got to get that rumen microflora, Those bacteria and protozoa, you got to get them changed from forage digesters to starch digesters. And so you got to do that in a gradual way. If the animal goes off feed, you're going to have to back down and start over. And you know, if you got feed left, that's a good sign. You're probably pushing the max. You want to clean out that old feed, throw it away, give it to something else. And then maybe not feed quite as much the next day. You want it so they just clean it up right before you feed again. What problems should you look for when feeding? Again, watch the bunk. If there's a lot of feed left, you need to make some adjustments there. Watch for bloating. If you're seeing some bloating, that probably means you need to add a little bit more hay to your ration. And so that we had an animal at State Fair. I was a superintendent. It was having trouble. We gave it some hay. Like I said, about a nest full of hay, like a bird's nest size. That animal, we never had no more trouble with it. But if we wouldn't have fed it some hay, he gave it a little bit of bloat guard, and we never had a bit of trouble the rest of the show for that animal. Otherwise, I think we could have lost it because it was really bloated. Water is really important to keep it fresh. Monitor it daily. Smaller quantities of water is better. It stays fresher that way. Stays cooler. It's not as hot. Hand fill versus automatic water trough. You know, I'm okay with automatic waters. I had a water tank we used that we fed our goats on, but I think keeping it clean is really important. Also, that's going to help you with kidney stones or any kind of stones or bladder stones that you might get in an animal. If they get more water, they're more likely to wash that through their system. There's a water there that I have a picture of. Works very well for goats. Okay. Water is the most important. It makes up muscle is about 70% water. So if you don't think why we stress on water, it's really important. Digestion requires water, especially in ruminant animals. Lots of fluid in there. They produce lots of saliva so that they can balance and buffer that stomach. That's all good because it's all made of water. Body temperature control requires water. Immune system requires water. And increased water intake will lower chances, like I said, of urinary calculi or kidney stones. Exercise is, I think, really important. We used to exercise ours sometimes twice a day, sometimes once a day, depending on what we had going on. But twice a day is better. Usually in the morning, at night, the goats loved it. They were ready to run. We walked down the county road. If they're too thin, you want to hold off on sprints. You maybe don't want to walk them quite as much because you're trying to build energy on them, but you're also trying to tone that muscle up. Don't wait until they're over finished to start walking them. You need to walk them, and I tell you what, they'll just do better. They'll eat better. They love to walk, and they'll be better in the show ring for you if you walk them. Monitor your body condition every week in that loin area, like it showed in that one on the one picture I showed. That's going to help you know if you're finished or underfinished. If they get too fat, you know, if we're wanting, we may have to cut them back on their feet a little bit. We may walk them more. We exercise to tone them. They're going to use that. They're going to have exercise in the pens if you watch them. But they really do like to walk. You walk them to the scale. Practice them with showmanship. That's get some exercise also. Any exercise your goat get is just likely is toning, just like you lifting weights or doing other things to increase your body muscle, running, those kind of things. Goats is the same way. And you want to do it the entire project period. Like I said, don't just start at the last minute. Do this like you're taking them to the show. How do goats see the world? I want to do a little bit on vision. They have excellent peripheral vision. They're wide-angled, excellent distant vision. Difficulty judging distances. Color perception. They move towards light. Fearful of shadows, and they're sensitive to hearing. If you yell a lot, goats are going to run to the corner and hide. They're very sensitive, and that's kind of a predator thing, I think, in them. How do they differ from sheep and other livestock? They're more difficult to handle than cattle when using handling equipment. Goats are stressed more easily. I've seen goats lay down and almost die just because they got all stressed. So you need to work with them, make sure they know you. When they get fearful, they lie down, like I said, and they'll pack into corners or run over each other and even smother each other. They can become aggressive towards each other also when you've got somebody in the pen making them nervous. You may need higher gaits than sheep. Though sheep equipment will work. And goats will find the escape spot every time. They're really good at finding spots that are weak, and they're going to find them and use them to get out. Um, if you work with your animal, the animals become tame. Goats raised in close contact with people experience less stress when they're being handled, so you want to work with them a lot. Tame goats may not have a flight zone, so they're going to come right up to you. They also can be a little dangerous at times with their horns because they're not realizing they're being rough. They can be a little difficult to drive. It's probably easier to lead them with a feed bucket or a halter. And you can train them to accept restraint voluntarily if you work with them. Um, Horns, goats should never be caught or dragged by horns. They should be picked up by their body, not horns or hair. They don't like that. You can restrain a goat by holding the base of the horns, not the tip. And if you're showing them, you certainly want the tip horns blunt to prevent injury to people showing them. So you need to blunt them off about the size of a dime or quarter at the end. So otherwise, you can dehorn them or you can get pulled. But a lot of ours still show with horns, but they need to be blunted. If they're not blunted, I used to make them at the state fair, go fix them before we would check them in. Showmanship. Showmanship is just the art of making an animal look as good as possible. You should be a second thought to your goat. That means you've worked with it a lot, so it knows what you're going to do. Showmanship starts with work at home. Start at home by teaching your goat to lead and stand still while you're holding them on chain. I see a lot of people that just put a chain on at the show. That is the worst thing you can do. The goat's choked down. It looks like we're being very mean to our animals. We need to have them used to a chain if you use a chain ahead of time. And practice hard work at home. Practice and hard work at home will pay off. The other thing on your chain, some of those chains have just a little bit of a hook in them. That's a good training chain for them. Some shows won't allow those to be used at the fairs. Some of them will. But they're really good to start a goat out on because it does poke them a little bit so they kind of pay attention to the chain instead of being choked down. Also, where you place the chain is really important so they don't choke. Talk a little bit about how to switch positions. So here we have a goat switching from position 4 to position 2. You can see he goes out front, turns around, comes back, goes back in. If we look at how to go from position 2 to position 7, you can just see that's another way. These are ways you can switch positions, and it's a proper way to do it. Chain up your goats at home. This will teach them they're used to having a chain on their neck and head, and you'll have control that way. So work on them. I don't mean just tying them to a fence. I mean working with them with a chain. Tying them to a fence could be dangerous, and you could choke one down. So I would recommend using a chain when you're working the goat for a show. Work goats on a show table to teach them to brace without stepping out or back. So if you want your goat to push against you when the person is filling it, or to keep it from walking, if you put it on a show table and then push it, and then after falling off a few times with the back feet, it will brace against you, and that will get it to brace in the show ring. It works really well. We practiced this with some of our kids at our local county fair. Those goats did much better. You also can restrain your goat by placing the knee in front of your shoulders. That'll help with the brace also. And then I have figure A. You can see the feet. You want to make sure that they're squarely placed beneath the goat. You don't want them way outside. You don't want them way under. You want to make that goat look thick and wide, right? But you also don't want to make it so wide that it's too far out and it doesn't look square. This is just some other showmanship techniques. The J stands for judge, the S stands for showman. You can see where the judge is located, where the showman should be located. Also, where they're circling, the judge is in the middle. You can see everybody's on the outside. If the judge is on the outside, you can see how they're moving the goats around. And when you get to a certain spot, you're going to switch to the inside so the judge can see the goat. Because we're really wanting the judge to see the goat, not you. Did I go through that too fast? Questions?
That was great. Thank you very much, Randy. We did have a couple of questions come in the chat box, so I'm going to read those as I launch the poll, and we'll just kind of have you answer those as we go. First question kind of refers back to the withdrawals on some of the products you had mentioned.
Right.
And the question is, with withdrawal in milk, is that for human consumption or for goat kids too?
That would be human consumption. Goat kids would be okay with it. I mean, they could. It's okay if there's antibiotic in the milk. Well, it'd be okay probably for goats because you can worm a kid pretty young. So I think you're probably okay there. But for humans, it is a problem because some of those wormers can be really harsh on the digestive tract of babies. And so we want to make sure that you don't get them. I had that question one time in Missouri, and the person went ahead and dewormed, and they couldn't use the milk because it was not safe for human consumption. Especially babies, it's a really challenge. But for kid babies, for goats, it's not an issue.
Okay, next question. How is the animal's performance or reproduction affected long term if you have to treat a goat with a heavy parasite load?
In a lot of cases, they're going to be later breeding back. The kids will be you'll wean off lighter kids on them, and sometimes their kids are more parasite susceptible. So a lot of times if they get too thin, they won't breed back, or they'll breed back really late. So having a parasite load is not good because it can affect reproduction.
Okay, and kind of to follow up on the worming side of things, at what age can you start worming?
Usually, they'll recommend 2 to 3 weeks, but I would talk with your local vet. That's one thing I'm not really versed on as well. A lot of times, we want you to deworm the ewe or the doe before she kids, and then they usually wait till like 5 weeks. But if you've not dewormed the doe, you might have to do it a little sooner. Usually that's when we give the Covexin and stuff too, is that 4 to 5 weeks. So we usually do everything on the goat at that time, baby goat. It can be pretty harsh, so you want to be careful on baby goats. Some of those drugs are pretty harsh. Some of them, like the ivermectins, they're much safer drug than like the Valvazin and some of those. So you got to be careful. Safeguard is probably a fairly safe one because that's why it's called Safeguard. But you want to be careful, and I would sure check with your vet before I did it. They're going to have a lot more experience on that than I do. Most people are going to do it. They're going to deworm the doe before she kids, because what happens right before she kids, that parasite just explodes in there and starts producing like mad because her resistance goes down right before she kids. So you want to worm her before she kids, and that way she's also not spreading those worms and those eggs to those babies. She's cleaner, and then you can wait and deworm later at that 4 to 5 weeks.
All right, the other question, what is the recommended age for tipping or dehorning?
I actually have not seen a recommended age. We have tipped our goats at, before fair. But if you're dehorning, I like to see it done when they're young. And I've seen them done pretty young, basically. Most of them that I've seen done are usually done with hot irons. And a lot of times the vet will they'll deaden that area. And then they'll go and they'll burn. If you burn it just right, you'll lose the horns. But I think if you're going to do that, you need to do it at a young age. And I've seen it probably a week old. You want to be careful if they're a weak kid, of course. And like goats, any stress thing really can come off on them. But the ones I've seen are really young. You don't want to wait too long. If you wait too long, it's not going to work very well. So probably a week to 2 weeks old. I've seen them done later than that. I've seen them done at like 4 to 5 weeks. But you want to be careful if you do it much later than that. I don't know if you'll have good success. But I've not done a lot of goats, so that kind of tells that I would check with somebody that does a lot of goats. That would give you a better answer.
Okay. I don't see any other questions coming in. Just kind of to wrap up, if you were providing a few tips to people who are trying to consider showing goats or raising goats for their own production, what would be kind of your take-home message to maintain the welfare of those animals and their condition?
The one thing I didn't mention is predator control. That's probably number one. I would get a guard animal or guard dog. I just think that's the safest way because coyotes and everything like small ruminants. So predator control, parasite management is of the utmost. And then proper fencing, something that'll keep a goat in. Goats will not stay in the same fence that sheep or cattle will. So you're going to have better fencing for them. But if you'll manage the parasites, if you watch the predator control, and you'll get the proper fencing, you're going to be much happier as a goat producer. Those three things are really important. And also overeating is going to be you're going to need to vaccinate for overeating. That's one thing you have to do with goats, and tetanus. Those two are really important.
Well, great. Thank you for your expertise, Randy. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Our next Animal Care Wednesday webinar will be June 5th. This year, we are trying kind of every other month for our Animal Care Wednesday webinars. So put a hold on your calendar for June 5th at 11 o'clock. We will see you then. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thanks.